Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for another in our Gulf Rising series. We're going to be looking at how regional powers are reacting to Turkey's resurgence in the Middle East. And so try to look at it from several different points of view. And I'd like to first of all begin by asking you to join me in turning your phones and pagers and other noise-making devices to silent or off or some other way in which it won't interrupt us, so that's very kind. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joining us online, because we tend to get a very good audience online these days. So what we'll do is we'll have a conversation here among ourselves for about 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to comments and questions from the audience. And if you could just identify yourself and keep it brief, that would be terrific. So I'm Hussein Ibish. I'm a senior resident scholar here at the Arab Gulf States Institute, and I want to very much thank our panelists. You can read their bios in the little flyer you have, but to introduce them, Gönül is the founding director of the Middle East Institute Center for Turkish Studies and an adjunct professor at GW University, and a very respected expert on Turkey and the Middle East. And to my right, our dear friend Stephen Cook is the Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at Council on Foreign Relations, and is a internationally renowned expert on Turkey and the Arab world, and I think particularly on Turkey. He's just one of the very best people in the country. So we're extremely grateful to them for coming to discuss this issue with us. So I think it's not really disputed that in the past few years, Turkey has risen as a new, more assertive power in the Middle East. And there are many different ways of conceptualizing this and many different ways of describing it, and several competing narratives about what happened to make Turkey develop into a more assertive power and what that means for the region, how to interpret Turkey's more attentive, focused, proactive role in the Middle East. But certainly I think it's fair to say that this development, along with several others, have broken the GCC, six-member Gulf Cooperation Councils, into two halves, so to speak. Not two competing camps, but two halves. And this is a division that's repeated again and again in the GCC in recent years. You've got a fairly unified perspective on the rise and new role of Turkey from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, which are in a very close alliance on regional issues, and Bahrain as well, because Bahrain really tends to defer to Riyadh these days on foreign and defense issues for the most part, not necessarily domestic issues by any means, but on international relations it does. So there's a kind of fairly well integrated reaction from those three. That's half of the GCC. And then you've got the other three members who take different perspectives, different from those three and different from each other. Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. So I'd like to describe these briefly, these four reactions to the rise of Turkey. I'll begin with the three who are separate. Qatar is, generally speaking, delighted with the rise of Turkey. I think it's very clear that Turkey's role in assisting Qatar when the boycott began in 2017 was absolutely essential for Qatar, not necessarily practically, although in some respects it was practically essential, but also from the point of view of morale, national morale, and the confidence that Qatar had that it could create a way out of this situation and survive this extreme pressure that he came under and find a way to make it a manageable new normal. And clearly, Turkey's military base in Qatar is a part of it, Turkey's trade, Turkey's cultural relations, all of this is very important to Doha. And I think clearly the boycott and the Turkish strong response, both symbolic and practical, was not only very important, but it solidified this relationship, solidified its regional nature, and also helped to clarify for everybody, including the principals, that for all of their mutual reciprocal help that they give each other, Qatar is certainly the junior partner in this relationship. And I think that became quite clear. If it wasn't clear before, it was clear after. And I'll talk about how the other three GCC countries view all of this in a second when I come to them. But suffice it to say, Qatar, I think, sees the rise of Turkey as almost entirely good, if not entirely good, for Doha. Kuwait, I think, feels very squeezed by this confrontation within the GCC, by the conflict or the confrontation between Qatar and the other three GCC countries. I think they feel very squeezed in their role as a mediator. They've kind of asked or encouraged to be a mediator with Iran, to be a mediator with Qatar, and they've come under a lot of criticism for doing exactly that, for doing that which was asked of them. And so I think in many different respects, Kuwait has been trying to reach beyond its traditional foreign policy of being pro-American and relying on a maximally unified GCC and looking to diversify its options. And one aspect of that is reaching out to Turkey and creating things like the military cooperation agreement that they reached at the end of last year. And we had in our last public panel here about a week ago, we had Professor Shaiji, a well-known Kuwaiti political scientist, and I asked him about the relationship with Turkey. And he said, well, you know, in Kuwait, we think Turkey is a useful, responsible player and a good partner, and we're very happy to see them. So there's mixed feelings in Kuwait, and they clearly do see the rise of Turkey as a more engaged regional power, as an opportunity for them to expand their range of options, gain wiggle room, gain more alternatives and breathing space. I think a similar logic is taking place with Oman, which similarly feels squeezed and potentially anxious about the other Gulf countries. But in that case, it's more a question of building ties with Turkey, and they are doing that, especially economically, rather than strengthening existing ties, which is the case with Kuwait. Which brings me to the three countries that tend to have very harmonious views on regional issues, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain. They really view Turkey, I think, increasingly as a new regional pole, as a new potential hegemon, as the leader of an emerging camp within the Middle East, which can be viewed roughly as, at least in terms of where it wants the region to go and the Arab world to go, as a Sunni Islamist camp. In that sense, while the Qatari government may not be Islamist themselves, it promotes the brotherhood wherever possible, and certainly in the Arab republics. They see, I think, a real integration here, an increasingly unified, vertically integrated group of brotherhood and pro-brotherhood parties, plus Qatar, certainly Hamas in Gaza, and many of the militias in Libya and others, and increasingly under, their perspective is that this is increasingly under the leadership of Ankara. It's not just a kind of group of like-minded actors, but that Turkish foreign policy is being reflected in this movement in a way much more analogous to the way that the pro-Iranian camp in the Middle East sort of follows Iran's interests. Now, obviously, it's a real, if that's true, there's a real issue, because Qatar can hardly be strongly pro-U.S. and strongly pro-Turkey if Turkey and the U.S. are not in agreement on everything. But in fact, reality is much more malleable than these narratives allow. But I think it's fair to say these narratives are very important because they tend to guide policy making. I think this is really the perspective that exists in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Manama, and I think above all in Abu Dhabi. There is this sense that Turkey is emerging as a regional hegemon. And they listen to the rhetoric about Turkish leadership, Turkey being the only logical leader of the Muslims. Turkey is this kind of revanchist neo-Ottoman rhetoric that you get sometimes from different people in Turkey. And it's interpreted as serving a legitimating function for this hegemonic agenda, they believe. So that, I think, this is a short and reductive overview, but I think it's fairly accurate. I'd like to ask my friend Steve to go ahead and give us his perception of how Turkey rose and why, and then we'll ask Gönül to join us and tell us how she thinks Turkey perceives its regional role. What does Turkey, what's it doing and what does it think it's doing? So we'll begin with you, Steve.
Well, thanks very much, Hussein. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I enjoy, once again, our collaboration. For those of you, for a little bit of context, Hussein and I collaborated on a very similar paper in 2015?
Yeah, 2016.
2016.
2016.
And in my contribution to that, I outlined a number of phases of Turkish engagement in the Middle East. The first one, after the Justice and Development Party came to power, was one of a regional troubleshooter and problem solver.
Right.
The second phase of Turkish engagement was Turkey's Hamas phase. This was the phase in which Turkey was uniquely active in its support for Hamas, which was quite different from other regional governments. From there, Turkey entered its latest version of the Turkish Model phase. This is the post-Arab uprisings in which Turkey was supposed to shepherd genuine transitions to democracy and prosperity in the Middle East. A number of events got in the way with that, no less the Syrian civil war, the intervention in Libya, and of course, I think probably the most important episode during this period was the coup d'etat in Egypt, which placed Turkey at odds with many of the most important countries in the region. Then, of course, domestically, you had the Gezi Park protests, which I think for a lot of young people in the Arab world who previously seen Turkey as a country that was, if not democratic, moving towards democracy, and a country that was prosperous, that there really was something to this idea of Turkey as a model, but that when President Erdogan presided over a summer-long effort to put down these uprisings in ways that they had grown familiar with in the famous public spaces throughout the Arab world. It really took, as we say, a shine off of the Turkish model. The combination of all of these things led to essentially a collapse of Turkey's position in the Middle East, where it had been in 2012 and 2011, riding quite high, quite popular throughout the region. It was establishing important relationships, deepening other important relationships. Post the military's intervention in Egypt, much of that collapsed. That led to, actually, in an odd way, a more assertive phase for Turkey in the Middle East, and one that continues to this day. And that more assertive phase was related to the war in Syria, but also had to do with dynamics in the Gulf region. And the Turkish foreign policy elite, President Erdogan, clearly see an American, Saudi, Emirati, Israeli, Egyptian order in the region as not being good for Turkey or very good for the region. It sows chaos, creates problems, it denies justice for Palestinians, it enables repression, it's unnecessarily provocative towards Iran, and most important, this regional order that the Turks don't like constrains Turkish power. the Turks would be very happy to lead the region in concert with the United States so long as the United States alters its view of the Saudis, Israelis, and Emiratis. And this has led, as I said, to this more assertive Turkish foreign policy in the region, the centerpiece of which is its relationship with Qatar. Much of the discussion recently about the Turkish-Qatar relationship goes back to the blockade that was imposed by the Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians, and Bahrainis in June 5th, 2017, the new June 5th. It's true that this saw a deepening of the relationship after the blockade, but the relationship existed prior to it.
Sure.
And for the Turks, there was an ideological component to cooperation with the Qataris post-Arab uprisings. And that is that I think both governments agreed that there was an opportunity for both of them in the region. I think the Turks, the kind of intellectual leadership of the Justice and Development Party, saw, and I think was central to their worldview, that Islamist movements were the wave of the future in the region. That countries like the UAE, countries maybe even like Qatar and Bahrain and others, were ephemeral, and that Islamist movements were rising. The only permanent countries in the region really were Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. The rest of them were pretty much things that would fall to the wayside as Islamist movements emerged, became more successful, and that Turkey was perfectly positioned to lead them. This comes from the valorization of the Ottoman period that's central to the AKP worldview, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe that the Qataris were as ideologically disposed as the Turks, but nevertheless also saw a tremendous opportunity in the uprisings as a way to extend this very, very small country's influence around the region, to continue its prime directive, which was to make sure that it did not become like Bahrain, that is a wholly owned subsidiary of Saudi Arabia. And so support for the region's Islamist movements, whether it's in Egypt, whether it was in Libya, whether it was in Tunisia and other places, became mutually reinforcing. And then on top of that, you have the June 5, 2017 blockade, in which the Qataris are completely cut off from the region, looking for support, looking for strategic depth. And yes, there was lots of discussion at the time about Qatari-Iranian relations. I think too much has been made of the Qatari-Iranian relations. And who, other than the Turks, came to the rescue of the Qataris? They established an air bridge. Their military base in Qatar was increased. And as a reward for helping the Qataris, the Emiratis have responded in kind with, at important moments, injections of cash or gifts, like a brand new airplane for President Erdogan. Clearly, the Turks see Qatar as a strategic partner and part of a broader effort to establish Turkey as a power in its own right in the region. But it's not just about Qatar. As Hussein pointed out, the Turks are looking for opportunities. And as the Kuwaitis have run into trouble with the Saudis and the Emiratis over their efforts to either resolve the conflict between the Qataris and their neighbors, or Kuwait's more nuanced view on other regional problems, the Kuwaitis have looked towards Turkey for support and depth. As Hussein pointed out, Turkey has positioned itself with the Kuwaitis as a competent regional power that is not bent on sowing chaos around the region. And there's a very similar dynamic in which the Turks have presented themselves to the Omanis, who are also coming under increasing pressure, and particularly from the Emiratis, over the situation in Yemen, as well as their relations with Iran. The relationship between the Kuwaitis and the Iranian and the Turks are more well developed, and as Hussein said, Oman is in the process of building ties with the Turks, which the Turks can now say that they actually lead a group of countries in the region that is counterposed to that American, Emirati, Saudi, Israeli, Egyptian order. And this is and this accrues to the benefit of the Turks because Turkey, like other countries in the region, I'm not saying that Turkey is like Iran or Turkey is like Russia, but like those countries, Turkey clearly believes that an American-led order in the region detracts from Turkey's power, detracts from Turkey's interests, and has gone about building this access. What will be interesting, and I'll end here, what will be interesting is what a confrontation between the United States and Iran does to Turkey, Turkey's views, and Turkey's position with these newer Gulf partners. Turkey has never seen Iran in the same light that U.S. policymakers have seen Iran. It is not a threat. It is an opportunity. Perhaps it's a competitor. It is a point of leverage with the United States. But it is not a country that is regarded, at least throughout the AKP period, as a significant threat. Significant threat to Turkey. I'll end there and hand it over to my friend Gönül.
Yeah, I'll bring in Gönül aside just to add something, and maybe you can respond to this as well. It seems to me, of course you're right, that the Turks had never seen Iran the way the Americans have, but it strikes me that when the Syrian war was active, Turkey's role in the broad international effort to try to unseat al-Assad made it essentially an antagonist to Iran, and that it is since the later part of 2016, culminating in the fall of Aleppo. It may have begun in the summer of 2016, but certainly by December 2016, you had a very different situation where, to secure its interests in Syria, Turkey was going to have to talk to Iran, to Russia, and even to al-Assad. And so it could no longer consider itself an antagonist.
Let me just before Gönül gets in, because you're responding directly to something that I said.
I'm sorry.
That there is I think with the Turks, there was a compartmentalization of their relations with the Iranians.
Sure.
There's throughout this period that you're talking about, there is commerce. Turkey plays a leading role in helping the Iranians evade sanctions on it for its nuclear development. So that, yes, they found themselves on the opposite ends of the Syrian civil war, but that did not mean that they could not manage that war, nor did it mean that it meant an end to economic and other types of relations. Certainly after the fall of Aleppo, and the Turks changed tack in Syria, and it becomes about preventing Kurds from establishing a state.
And you get the Astana process in the deconfliction zones. And all that. That's a different level of cooperation. But point taken. So how do you view all of this? What do you think Turkey is doing? We've had two versions of a narrative, or two different narratives here that end up with Turkey leading a like-minded group of countries. Is that something you agree with? Do you think that Turkey perceives itself as doing that? What do you think Turkey is up to from its own perspective? That's great.
First I would like to comment on the title of today's discussion, which is Turkey's new and assertive role. I think Turkey is a country in decline, and I think it doesn't have the capacity to play an assertive role, and neither it's doing anything new. So I think it's trying to keep the gains that it has made in the last few years and keep the very few friends that it has in the region. So I really would like to say that I think Turkey's role is neither new or Turkey is not an assertive power in the region. And I think Turkey doesn't really have a grand strategy, and it doesn't have a grand narrative. Those days are gone with the architect of that strategy, who is former foreign minister and prime minister Ahmet Davutoğlu. So I think I kind of agree with Steve that we can talk about three different phases of Turkey's foreign policy. The first being right after the AKP's rise to power in 2002. I think after AKP came to power, Erdogan established a very pragmatic relationship with the region. ideology and big ideas didn't really play a major role in Turkey's engagement with the Middle East. So in that regard, the AKP's foreign policy was not a radical break from a traditional Western-oriented Turkish foreign policy. It still pursued close ties to the West. So its Middle Eastern strategy, engaging the region, becoming more involved in regional affairs, was just a complement to Turkey's relations with the West. And it was not that different from former Prime Minister and President Turgut Özal in the 1980s. He pursued a similar policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. So when we talk about, well, Turkey was never a real actor in the Middle East before the AKP, that's not really accurate. Turkey developed close trade and economic ties and wanted to invest, particularly attract Gulf investment in the 1980s and 1990s. So Turgut Özal at the time, who became the prime minister after 1980 military coup, he had that vision. He wanted to he still, the main direction of Turkey's foreign policy was still that Western orientation, and yet he thought that diversifying Turkey's foreign policy was important. So he reached out to the Middle East, he reached out later in the 90s to Turkic republics. But of course, there were structural impediments to that. So that's why that vision of becoming more involved in the Middle East didn't really materialize. In the 80s and 90s, the military was still playing a very prominent role, and the Kemalist elite still thought that Turkey should invest its diplomatic energy in the West. And the 1990s were very difficult years for Turkey, so that was the reason why Turkey wasn't a very active actor in the region, but I think the political will was there. So after the AKP came to power, Turkey approached similarly to Turgut Özal. They approached tourism primarily, I think, to advance its economic interests. So there were different pillars to Turkey's strategy at the time. One was advancing Turkey's economic interests. I remember whenever Prime Minister Erdogan paid a visit to a regional capital, he was accompanied by hundreds of Turkish businessmen. Those were to become the new middle class, the so-called Anatolian tigers. So trade and investment was an important component of AKP strategy at the time. And another interest that Turkey had in the region was curbing Kurdish nationalism. This was after 2000, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and there was the Kurdish nationalism was on the rise. So Turkey had that fear. And also, another aim of Turkey's Middle Eastern policy was to curb Iranian power. Iran was again on the rise after the U.S. invasion. So I think those three pillars were the backbone of Turkey's regional strategy at the time. And of course, there were domestic drivers behind that strategy. The AKP had just come to power, so it was still a vulnerable actor in domestic politics. Military still called the shots. The Kemalist security establishment, the Kemalist establishment was still very much strong. So the AKP was in a very vulnerable position, and that was one of the reasons why it didn't completely break from Turkey's traditional Western-oriented foreign policy. And there was still the fear of Kurdish separatism because of the Iraq war. And Turkey was domestically recovering from an economic crisis. And regionally, Iraq was disintegrating. Iran was expanding its power in the region. And of course, it was the post-September 11th world, where the Gulf countries were viewed by skepticism, and they faced discrimination in Western markets. And the oil prices were rising. So this was the context in which Turkey decided to engage the region. So particularly with regard to the GCC and the Gulf countries, this was the context in which the Gulf countries, Gulf monarchies, they had a lot of money and they were looking for an alternative market. And Turkish economy was just recovering from an economic crisis. So Turkey was the perfect alternative to Western markets. And there was a new foreign policy elite, the AKP elite, so it was an attractive alternative. And that's how that economic partnership began. But I think Turkey, the AKP leadership, refrained from emphasizing the security or ideological dimension of the partnership. It was purely a very pragmatic economic partnership. And at the time, the trade relationship between Turkey and the GCC improved. The Gulf investment, the Gulf countries started investing more and more under the AKP. And one indication of that, how the AKP saw the region in those years, was when Abdullah Gül, that was right after he became the president, he paid a historic visit to Riyadh. That was, I believe, 1 year after the Saudi king paid his first visit after 40 years.
Yeah.
So Abdullah Gül went there in 2007, and Turkish delegation there had two main demands from the Saudis and the Gulf. And one was to make it easier for Turkish businesses to operate within the GCC and to attract investment from the GCC. And another one was allowing the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus to open a consulate in Riyadh. So Cyprus also played an important role in Turkey's calculations in the region and its approach to other the Arab countries. But it wasn't until 2008 when Turkey started emphasizing the security dimension of its relationship with the Gulf countries. That was when they signed an MOU on security cooperation. So this was, and those years, it was a new page. The narrative in Turkey vis-à-vis the Arabs had changed. The narrative about Turkey in the region changed. So the historic narrative was that the Arabs stabbed Turks in the back in the First World War, and the Arabs thought that Turkey had turned its back on the Islamic civilization. So there was this tension. But with the AKP's rise to power, that narrative changed completely. So those years, initial years, were full of hope, and the region was an opportunity to be exploited by the AKP leadership. But again, there was no grand narrative, no big ideas, purely, I think, pragmatic. And then came the Arab Uprising. So that started a new era. That was an era when ideological factors started to play a dominant role in how Turkey saw the region and vice versa. Of course, starting from 2011, Ahmet Davutoğlu started talking about riding the wave of Arab uprisings. He really thought that Turkey could become the new regional hegemon. He thought that, that he called it a 100-year parenthesis. So he thought that finally the secularized elite is going to be replaced by democratic forces, mostly led by Islamists. So he capitalized on Turkey's relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. He worked very closely with, what was his name, the Al Jazeera, the head of Al Jazeera, Waddah, I think. Yeah, and Al Jazeera promoted this notion of Turkish model in the region. So those were the years when people started talking about the Turkish model. But also domestically, Turkey, this was a time when Turkey was talking to its Kurds. On the economic front, Turkey was doing okay. Turkey was still considered, despite all the problems, a democracy, a country, a NATO member, a country that was aspiring to become an EU member. Turkey had enhanced its soft power. But after Turkey's missteps, particularly in Syria, and the Gezi Park protest. So 2013, I think, was a significant year, because as Steve mentioned, I think that's when the Turkish model, the idea of a Turkish model, died. In 2013, we had Gezi protests, and that was the most significant uprising against Erdogan. And his heavy-handed approach to that, I think, completely changed Turkey's image on the Arab street. I remember in 2013, Erdogan paid a visit to Tunisia, and he was met with protests. So as early as 2013, I think the concept of Turkish model was dead. And also its support for Muslim Brotherhood, I think, drove a wedge in the Sunni bloc.
Crucial.
So that Turkey becoming an ideological actor in the region, I think really undercut Turkish interest and Turkish role. So now, the third phase, the post-Arab Uprisings era, we are almost back to square one when the AKP first came to power, because the AKP, today's AKP is as vulnerable and even maybe more vulnerable than it was when it first came to power.
Do you mean domestically or regionally?
Domestically, Erdogan, a consolidated power in his hands, he controls everything, there are no institutions, and yet I think he's very vulnerable. And the Kurdish question, again, Turkey's biggest fear, and I think the backbone of Turkey's regional policy is once again the fear of Kurdish separatism. And Turkish economy is very vulnerable, so I think the main driver behind Turkey's regional strategy today is economic partnerships. So, I know this was a long
No, it's okay. I
presentation.
wanted to ask you about that.
But I just want to say something to what, when we talk about Turkey-Qatar partnership, I know, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood connection is very important, so you might think that this is a purely ideological partnership.
No.
I somewhat disagree with that, because I think economy is still one of the main drivers. Of course, Erdogan has a very personal relationship with the elite, and I think he really trusts Qatar. But if you look at, for instance, just recently, Qataris, Erdogan issued a decree, privatized a Turkish tank factory. And the Qataris have a 49.9% stake in that. This is historic. And it's a major problem for the opposition. But I think the main, so you might think that the ideological connection is driving this. But I think,
I don't think so.
For Erdogan, building an indigenous defense industry is the key. And he sees the region, particularly the Gulf, as a major market and consumer of Turkish defense industry.
So obviously, economic concerns were one of several important reasons why Erdogan and the Turkish government were careful in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder affair not to go too far.
Yes, that's right.
With Saudi Arabia. However, while Saudis are not being asked to divest themselves of real estate, all the contracts are being reviewed, and it's going to be much harder, much harder for Turks to do business with Saudi Arabia and get and maintain Saudi investment and all of that. So is this just the price of doing business, or is this something, is there any plan to deal with this? How do you think that in other words, here's my point. If Turkey's foreign policy is to a large extent driven by economic concerns, there's a big economic cost attached to it at this point. So how do we think about that? Can you answer that, and then I'll see if you want to,
No, I think that's why Turkey is deepening its ties with Qatar. Saudis, at least in 2018, they were still the number one investor in Turkey from the Gulf, followed by the UAE, Kuwait, and I think Qatar came in fifth or so.
So we expect that to change, don't we?
No, that's definitely going to change,
Yes.
and I think Turkey's plan is to court Qatar even more.
Okay, so do you see it as driven mainly by economics? I mean, what do you?
No, I do.
Yeah, I figured you might not.
No, because I think that economics is not the explanation for all political phenomena.
Right.
And so
Plainly not.
if foremost on Turkey's mind was economics, especially as it has entered into economic headwinds, it would not have done the things that it has done around the region. Now, of course, they've treated the King of Saudi Arabia differently from the way in which they've treated
The Crown Prince. Yeah.
the Crown Prince. But of course, this has had an impact on the way in which the Saudi government, the Emirati government, and others look at Turkey as an actor. They look at Turkey as
hostile,
as you point out, as another pole in a geostrategic game. It's also very true that the Turks are able to compartmentalize their relations, as I pointed out with regard to Iran, as is clear in their relations with Israel. But it strikes me that the relationship with the Gulf is about Turkish geopolitics, which I think is you can't separate Turkish perception of geopolitics with their own actual pragmatism when it comes to the region. And although I don't think I made the case that Turkey's relationship with the Qataris is driven by an ideological affinity, or that it was driven by necessarily an ideological affinity with the Muslim Brotherhood, there is a worldview that is at work when it comes to Turkey's relationships, not just with Qatar, but with other countries
shared goals.
in the region.
I think we could call them shared goals, couldn't we? Yeah.
I don't want to be misunderstood.
So do respond. Yeah,
I
please.
don't want to be misunderstood, though. I'm not saying that economic considerations are the only driver. I think no, ideological factors play a role, but in a complicated way. Turkey took steps. Again, during the Arab Uprisings, Turkey was very pro-Muslim Brotherhood and took certain steps. So there is a path dependency now, so Turkey cannot take a step back. So ideology plays a role, but it's not the main driving force behind what Turkey is doing in the Gulf or in the region. If anything, it's Turkish nationalism.
Turkish nationalism, how is that conceptualized? I mean, are we talking here about regional power, effort, kind of hegemony, influence, or how does Turkish nationalism manifest itself in the Gulf? Well, what are we? Is this just raw power, or is there anything more complex? I don't know.
I think that page. So. I mean, I talked about the first phase of Turkey's foreign policy right after AKP came to power, and I talked about how hopeful the region was. And now it's a completely different. Turkey is a completely different place, and the region is a completely different place.
Yes.
After 2002, I think the region was open to Turkey's the idea of a Muslim world led by Turkey. That's not the case anymore. So now the narrative has changed too, and I want to say something that might sound strange, but there's always, you all understand how problematic Turkey's secularist relationship with the region, but even Turkey's Islamists had a very problematic relationship with the region, with the Islamists of the region, because of that Ottoman Orientalism. So even the Islamists of the Ottoman Empire saw the other Islamists and the Muslim countries in the region as players to be modernized by Turkey. So I think that notion is now back. That perception is now back, which leaves very little room for Turkey to play a leading role in the region. And in terms of Turkish nationalism, again, it doesn't mean that Turkish Islamism has a very strong dose of nationalism, which makes it different than Arab Islamism.
Very different.
So that nationalism, that fear of Kurdish separatism, for instance, I think is a major force behind what Turkey is doing in the region. And part of the tension with Saudis and UAEs, I remember, I think it was a few months ago when there were UAE and Saudi delegations visiting Syrian Kurdish militia.
Yes.
And that made headlines in Turkey and strengthened that anti-Saudi anti-UAE sentiment. So the
And
Turkish nationalism plays a role.
in contradistinction, Gulf sympathy for Kurdish nationalism has never been higher than it is right now as a direct consequence of this. So, and we keep talking about narratives, and we've talked about different ones. I mean, I think the one way of looking at how the narratives have developed, at least in the Arab world, over the 15 years we're talking about, it sort of begins in 2002, 2003 to 2011 with a kind of a narrative of binaries, with a group of states and forces that are essentially pro-status quo versus a group of states and forces of which Turkey was sort of a part in a way, though it was still kind of oriented towards Europe, and it was playing with this. You've called it the Hamas period for Turkey. I think that's right, where the anti-status quo forces called themselves the axis of resistance and called the other side the axis of accommodation. And on the other side, they called themselves, the pro-status quo called themselves the moderates and called the anti-status quo the radicals. And I think this more or less defined the kind of war of narratives between 2002, 2003 until 2011. And 2011, when the dust settles from the Arab Spring, I think the main narratives that emerge are kind of pro and anti-Iranian regional camps. It's not ideological, but in terms of governments and major forces, there's a set of forces that are sympathetic to Iran's regional ambitions and those that are thwarting it. And here you've got, as you pointed out, Turkey more or less, as a kind of half-hearted part of essentially wanting to thwart Iran, especially in Syria and elsewhere, in Iraq as well, is really being part of this kind of, you could say, a camp that did not want Iran's regional agenda to completely succeed. But since the late 2016, 2017, because of the change in Syria, because of the failed coup environment in Turkey and all of that stuff, you've got a really strong reevaluation between, at least this is the perception in a lot of the Arab world, that Turkey has reevaluated its relationship with Iran, that it has, in order to protect its interests in Syria, it has had to get involved in discussions with Russia, with Syria, and with Iran to try to thwart this potential creation of a Kurdish KRG Part 2 or mini-state in the southern border, a PKK-dominated area in the south. And that from that beginning point, combined with the boycott of Qatar and the consolidation of the Qatari-Turkish alliance, that what has happened is the production of the worldview that I was describing as being believed in by a large number of people, governments in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain, et cetera, that Turkey has emerged as a third pole, that then now it's not a binary situation, it's a ternary situation, triangular in the region. Now again, of course, reality is too complex. This is a reductive model. But I think many people, decision makers, policy makers in the Middle East, are proceeding as if there were three major camps at the moment, a pro-Iranian camp, a pro-Turkish camp, including Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and others, and basically a pro-American camp, essentially, of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, and Israel, and it's kind of an unhappy alliance with Israel, or uneasy alliance with Israel. And that one of the most interesting examples of tension between the second two poles, right, not the pro-Iranian, but how these other camps compete is all over the periphery of the Arab world, especially in the Horn of Africa, in North Africa, in Libya, and this business in Sudan recently, where Turkey and Qatar tried, Qatar had the $4 billion project to develop this island in the Red Sea, and Turkey was going to make it a military naval base, and this was all going very well, and they were kind of wooing Omar Bashir and Khartoum, which is always a wild card in these kinds of things, that had gone over from a pro-Iranian to an anti-Iranian stance, essentially, and that was being wooed now into a kind of pro-Turkish and pro-Qatari stance, which the overthrow of Bashir and the taking over of power in Khartoum by some very pro-Saudi people in Sudan has put a stop to for now. And that's one of the reasons, among others, that there's this $3 billion coming at Sudan from UAE and Saudi Arabia. So that's essentially that's a kind of narrative framework that's underlying, I think, some of the decision-making that we've been talking about. Could you respond to some of that? I mean, your take on all of that. And what I'm really interested in, by the way, from both of you, is, with Turkey, I mean, we've agreed, all of us, that Turkey is more assertive in the Middle East, that it's more of a player in the Middle East now. Is it that Turkey is less engaged with the West than it was, say, between 1920 and the rise of the AKP? Or is the engagement with the Middle East another way of communicating Turkish strength and power and authority and relevance to the West? In other words, is the West still the main Turkish interlocutor, or is the Middle East the really new focus of Turkish policy? So any of that, please respond, and then I'll come to you. Mm-hmm. Okay. A bunch of stuff on the tape.
Just a couple of thoughts on this, and then on your point about its relationship with the West. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Turkey and the idea that Turkey is a spent force, is a weakening force, is peaked. I hope we're not going to extrapolate the domestic events in Turkey over the course of the last 6 weeks to what Turkish foreign policy is. We don't know what's going to happen on June 23rd, but we know once we get beyond June 23rd, there is going to be a number of years before there's another election.
I think I might know, but that's okay.
Okay. All right. I'm being polite.
I know. I'm just kidding.
And because my recent track record is not 100% accurate on this.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
But it seems to, and of course, Turkey is experiencing significant economic headwinds, but that doesn't mean that Turkey does not perceive its interests in an active foreign policy in the region.
Yeah.
It has been involved in Libya, in Sudan, in next to the region, not quite in the region, Somalia, and obviously the Gulf, as we've outlined, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, clearly building an alliance to its pole.
Yeah.
And as you point out, Hussein, I think it's important to recognize that these poles are a kind of representation of reality, but not actual reality.
That's right.
That there can be a pole, but the Turks can still communicate with the Saudis.
Sure.
That there can be problems between the Saudis, between the Turks and the Israelis, but they can still communicate.
Powers can oscillate between poles like Qatar does.
Exactly.
Between the U.S. pole and the
it isn't
Turkish pole.
fixed,
Yeah.
but nevertheless,
Fixed,
if we're talking about the way in which Turkey and Turkish foreign policy elites, at least for the foreseeable future, see the region, they see it as a region that is in an opportunistic way. It may very well be that their economic situation impairs some of their plans, but nevertheless, there is a worldview, there is a reason that the Turks are involved in the region, and much of it has to do with their perspective of the West.
Yeah.
Not only do they believe they have this kind of weird cultural affinity, but also because there is a geostrategic imperative to it. And this is one of the things that I pointed out, is that the view that an American-led order in the region is not good, does not enhance Turkish power, is an important reason. It is also important that it strikes me that it is a way to communicate to the West that Turkey is a power in its own right. This is one of the kind of chief complaints that Turks have had over a longer period of time, that the West treats them
for granted,
exactly
dismissive manner,
and that Turkey can be an active player that shapes politics in a region that is.
So you're arguing that it's both, and the one serves the other. The Turkish dynamic engagement and assertive policies in the Middle East serve the broader
think,
perspective, which ultimately confronts the West.
I think that is without a doubt. And then getting back to this kind of knotty issue of ideology.
Yeah.
Ideology in this context is not just Islamism.
No, of course.
There's nationalism, there's
yeah.
nationalist Islamism, there's
Absolutely.
the Turkish-Islamic synthesis.
Right.
It is certainly the case that
kinds of
Islamists in the Middle East, in the Arab world, didn't like Islamists in Turkey, believing they were too liberal and they were too nationalist.
Too nationalist,
But
yeah.
the fact of the matter is that post 2011, after the Arab uprisings, Turkey has been, along with the Qataris,
Yeah.
important patrons of the very same people in which they have had these conflicts.
Right.
If not for ideological reasons, why were young Turkish schoolgirls marching up the street past the American embassy and stopping just beyond it, giving the Rabbah sign on their way in front of the Egyptian embassy?
Well,
now that may
quite.
just be Turkish trolling, but there was clearly something that was going on there. So I think it is a combination of all of these things.
So three things maybe for you to address, Gönül. One is the role of economics, and as there's kind of maybe a disagreement, I don't know, and if you want to respond to Steve on that, that's fine. The second is, I take your point about Turkey being beset by a lot of problems as a power, but I do think it's fair to say that a lot of regional players, a lot of Arab countries perceive Turkey as a rising power rather than a declining power. That's the perception,
Yeah,
and it may be wrong. And the third has to do with relations with the West. So go ahead.
I'll start with the second. I really don't understand how Turkey is perceived as a rising power in the region. It's so isolated. I mean, Turkey in Syria, for Turkey to do anything, it needs the Russian green light.
Yeah.
In Iraq, there's a current. There's so many problems with Iraq. Turkey almost lost the Iraqi Kurds, who were once Turkey's best allies in the region during the Iraqi independence referendum.
Right.
And Turkey has problems with Baghdad over Turkey's 2014 decision to sell Kurdish oil independently of without the approval of Baghdad. So there is a tension there. If you look at Libya, Turkey is again very, very isolated. With Sudan, for instance, we just talked about the dynamics there. Right. So it seems like Qatar and
Libya too.
Qatar is the only partner that Turkey has. And when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and the Turkish Islamists, that's right. Historically, Turkey's Islamists had built this network and close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, I would like to underline that there are differences of opinion within the Muslim Brotherhood vis-a-vis Turkey.
Oh, sure.
Remember that 2011 talk that Erdogan delivered in Egypt when he praised secularism that divided the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Why? Because Turkish Islamism is different.
Yes,
the notion, the word Sharia, the concept Sharia doesn't occupy a large place in Turkish Islamist ideology. So there are ideological differences. But I think both parties saw the Arab uprisings as an opening, but there are limits to what they can do and what Turkish Islamists can do in the region. So that's why I think Turkey still needs the West as an ally. And we've seen that just, I think it was last week when Erdogan was delivering a talk, he asked NATO to help Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean. There's a conflict brewing there over gas exploration, and Turkey has found itself very isolated.
Yeah. I remember during the Khashoggi thing, it was very important for Erdogan to get the United States involved in the conversation and not just have a conversation with Riyadh alone.
That's right, and Turkey didn't. When Erdogan was going after MBS, he paid special attention not to break ties with the king, with Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And I've heard from people who work for pro-government newspapers that they received orders from Ankara not to attack Saudis directly. So he was trying to isolate MBS. So that's why I think that's why Western the West and being a member of NATO is still very significant.
Yeah. Let's do
for
this.
Turkey.
Let's then complete the thought, and then we'll invite the audience in. So, what do you? I mean, Steve made the case that both are true. In other words, that Turkey is more engaged in the Middle East and especially the Sunni Muslim world, etc. But that ultimately the main interlocutor for Turkey remains Europe and the West.
That's right.
You think that? You think
That's
that's
right,
exactly
because
right.
yes,
Okay.
they have right before every election in Turkey, Erdogan attacks the West, Germany, Netherlands, the US, and then after the elections, he pays a visit and says how
makes
special
up.
relationship between Turkey and Europe is. So from
It's
both
a
an
normal marriage, then.
institutional perspective, Turkey is too tied to Western economic, political, and security framework that it just cannot simply break.
All right, that point of relative agreement is a good place to begin with Q&A, and we've got a gentleman here. Let me just say, if you could please identify yourself, speak into the microphone, identify yourself, and if it's a comment, please make it, but keep it brief.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. On the business of sort of neo-Ottoman developments, we noticed that when Russia closed the Kerch Strait, all of a sudden the long-envisioned naval base on the Black Sea at Trabzon was on the fast track.
Yeah.
And having seen Russia and Turkey playing footsie for the last 4 years or so, this brings up Turkey was suddenly scared of a Russian action.
Well.
And they weren't building that naval base for keeping away Bulgarians and
No.
Uzbeks and Georgians. So that's confusing me a bit. And also, can you shed some light on Turkey backing Maduro? I mean, that just makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, I kind of get that, but who would either of you want to tackle any of that?
I can address the Turkey-Russia question. I think it's always been a very complicated one. It's not as straightforward as it's seen here in Washington or other Western capitals. I think 2015, Turkey's threat perception vis-à-vis Russia has always been really high, historically, for centuries. And even the Ottoman Islamists saw Russia as the biggest threat. That's how Ottoman Islamism emerged as an ideology, as a response to Russian expansion. So that's always been there. And I think Erdogan was no different. 2015 was the year when Turkey thought that Russia became a huge threat for Turkey. And that's when Russia decided to militarily intervene in Syria. And after Turkey downed the Russian jet in 2015, President Erdogan begged NATO allies not to withdraw the Patriot missiles, thinking that Russia would somehow attack Turkey. But when that didn't happen, I think that was a turning point in Erdogan's thinking. He thought, Russia is a huge threat and my NATO allies are not supporting me. I'm all alone. So cultivating closer ties with Russia was his way of keeping the enemy closer, I think. So he thought, if I deepen the partnership with Russia, Russia will not pose a threat. And that's why I think, well, S-400, there's a more nuanced view to S-400, but Turkey is now very much dependent on Russia in terms of energy, in terms of trade. Again, in Syria, Turkey can't do anything without Russia, but that was all, I think, a byproduct of Turkish frustration over what it saw as the Western unwillingness to respond to Turkey's security needs.
Who's the new Black Sea naval base for?
I don't know.
Let me just say that I think there's an underlying logic to your question, which I think is a particular tick of Western analysts, myself included, which is this desire to place Turkey in a geographic location. It is either west, and if it's not west, it must be being lost to the east.
Right.
But I think lots of Turks see Turkey as Turkey. And so that its relationship, its history with Russia is complicated, and its relationship with the West is complicated, and its relationship with Russia is complicated. its complicated relationship and its fears and concerns about the West have not precluded it from becoming an economic partner of the West in many ways. And I think that it has, and the trouble that Gönül pointed out, I think is not a new one. I don't think it just came in 2015. The trouble with the West and the questioning about NATO's commitment to Turkey is not a new one. The difference is that there isn't an ideological problem at the heart of the Turkish-Russian relationship, so that there is an opportunity there. With all of the complications, with all of the fears, with all of the concerns, there is an opportunity there for the Russians. That's also add to the fact that post the fall of Aleppo, Turkey's views of what it wants out of Syria have changed dramatically. And if you want a certain thing in Syria, there's only one address, and it's Moscow. So it kind of constrains the Turks when it comes to their relationship with Russia. But I think it's we should stop thinking in this kind of binary way of Turkey is West or East, and if it's not West, we're losing it to the East.
Right.
The Turks sit in this place where clearly they perceive opportunities all around them. Everybody makes fun of Ahmet Davutoglu these days, but there was some insight into what he thought about when it came to a 360-degree foreign policy.
Yeah.
It was warmed over economic determinism, but there was this understanding that there could be opportunity all around.
But also, just I think it's important to note that U.S. actions also played an important role in Turkish-Russian rapprochement.
Sure.
I mean, we all know what happened in the U.S.-YPG partnership, but also recently, the Trump administration's decision to slap sanctions on Iran, I think it's making Turkey even more dependent on Russia.
I do have to respond to that one, because there is also a tendency among Turkish analysts to lay the blame for their strategic decisions on other decisions that the United States made.
I'm not.
I think it's clear that the Turkish government has a particular perspective and is not just responding to the United States, although it's a convenient excuse for Turks to say, well, we work with the Russians because of you.
No. That's not what I'm saying, and I'm not one of those analysts. But what I'm trying to say is this is not an ideological shift.
Yeah.
There is an argument that says there are Eurasianists within Turkish security establishment that promote closer ties to Russia, but that argument could be made. But I still think that Turkey is not willing to leave NATO. That this is not an ideological partnership. It was out of frustration. And the U.S. played a role. And even today, again, I would like to say that the Iran sanctions, Turkey has to buy more oil from Russia because of Iran sanctions. So U.S. actions have been making Turkey more dependent on Russia.
And a NATO ally backing Maduro?
Yeah, I was going to take a shot at that. Look, I mean, I'm no psychologist, and I don't know much about Turkish domestic rhetorical arguments, but it's not too mysterious to me. I mean, it strikes me as kind of anybody who feels slighted or thwarted by the global status quo, who wants to poke at the United States and adopt a stance both for domestic and international consumption of, let's say, global populism, and not, in the Turkish case, not to cede the sort of oppositional internationalism, if you want to put it that way, to say Iran, which is very close to Maduro, but to stake your claim of the to the sort of Chomsky narrative that everything is the United States' fault and everything's bad, and if there's something going on in Venezuela, I mean, in the Arab world, it's very, if I go on Twitter, there are all these otherwise sensible people who are convinced that the United States is the dominant actor in Venezuela. And I tell them it's completely irrelevant to what happens in Venezuela. And they get angry at me as if I had told them not a good piece of news, but something, horrible, that, the United States is not all powerful. And so I think it has to do with all of that. And it has the pattern of social justice and opposition and, the Mustazafan and all that.
Money.
Well, money too, yeah, of course. There's money. There's also money and the relationship with Russia. Which is another. So let's move on. That's the best I can do. So next question, please. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just, my name is Mohammed. I am with the Iraqi embassy. Just a clarification with Ms. Gönül. We do have good relationship with Turkey.
Yeah.
Despite we have a lot of different point of view with regards to the PKK present, water
The Turkish
issue,
military presence.
I don't know, the oil sales or whatever, but we do have good relationship, and we are trying to deepen this relationship because we should have that.
That's a very helpful comment. Thank you. So next question, please. Go right ahead.
Andrew Donahue from the Carnegie Endowment.
Hi.
I wanted to ask Dr. Cook about your comments about how increasing pressure from the United States on Iran will affect Turkish policy vis-a-vis Iran. To what extent do you feel that Turkey will be able to maintain diplomatic and economic relations with Iran? And do you think that in this case its economic vulnerability will eventually give the United States the upper hand in dictating Turkish policy vis-a-vis Iran?
You know, I think it's a great question, and I hazard to predict what the Turks might do should we get closer to a real confrontation between the United States and Turkey. I do know conflict between the United States and Iran, I should say. I don't want any, Turkish journalists or television network to believe that I'm calling for conflict between Turkey and the United States.
Right?
But I do know that Turkey has been a reluctant partner of the United States when it comes to Iran. The Obama administration had to work extremely, extremely hard at a number of critical moments in order to convince the Turks of doing certain things that the United States wanted to do with regard to Iran, whether it was the placement of the missile detection system, whether it was sanctions on Iran. Of course, there was the now infamous TRR deal in which the Turks and the Brazilians started to go around the United States, and then there are other lesser cases in which the Turks blew an Israeli spy ring in Istanbul that was watching the Iranians, et cetera, et cetera. The situation is obviously quite different today, and certainly Turkey, having felt the consequences of both American action, military action in the region, as well as American inaction in the region, once again finds itself in an extraordinarily, extraordinarily difficult circumstance. I suspect that if the United States cannot convince the Turkish government to give up its purchase of the S-400, it is unlikely to convince the Turkish government of the wisdom of American military action against Iran.
Yeah, I think that's
Can
very
I
clear.
add something to
of
that?
course.
Well, actually,
by all
narrative, Turkey has this defiant tone when it comes to Iran sanctions, saying that it will never comply with the sanctions, but it has been complying with the sanctions since May. So that I think to me that's very significant. The challenge for Turkey is to find alternative sources of energy. Iraq is one of them, and Russia. For Turks, Iranian oil is not cheap, but it's logistically it makes a lot of sense. But the Americans are pushing Turkey to buy purchase oil from the Saudis. That doesn't logistically make sense. It's very costly, and purchasing oil from Russia and Iraq are not without problems either. I think again, and you could answer that better than I do, but I think Turkish foreign minister was in Iraq. He wants to purchase oil from north and also Basra as well. But there's a court case going on, and I think we'll hear the results either in August or in September. So that's going to be very significant in terms of how the two countries move forward on energy cooperation. So yes, Turkey is looking for alternatives, and despite saying that it will not comply with the sanctions, it has been complying with the sanctions, mainly because, again, Turkey has just so many problems with the U.S. It doesn't want to take on U.S. at a time when its economy is officially in recession, and there's a threat of sanctions over S-400.
Okay, so we've got another question here, and then I might ask a closing question, and that'll be it. So go ahead, Hisham.
Hisham Malham, I want to take you back to the Western orientation of Turkey. I want you to address it in the context of the deepening polarization between the Islamists and the non-Islamists in Turkey. Obviously, the Turks, especially Erdogan, would like to remain in NATO. He benefits from that. He wants to be in NATO, but at the same time to have the liberty to criticize NATO and blame the West for some of his problems. But it seems to me that that traditional Western orientation that Mustafa Kemal began is sputtering now. And things are really more important culturally and socially in Turkey than the issue of the West not being happy with Erdogan over the S-400 or even the policy in Turkey. Turkey is the odd man out, where you have a strong tendency in Turkish society, in Turkish culture, that is really anathema to the West. I mean, they have that view towards the West. And the years of the Erdogan and AKP have deepened that sense. So you have a polity, political culture that is very critical of the West, very suspicious of the West, that all of the gains that the Turkish Republic achieved, from my perspective, when they were seeking entry to the EU, are being threatened now. And I don't think we've seen anything like that before. So that's why early, we were chatting before that with the rise of the AKP, the West was happy with the rising Turkish model, and they were telling the Arabs, we have the Turkish model, we have the bad Persian model.
Yeah.
And but now Turkey is problematic. And I usually watch what's happening in society. Forget what statement here, statement there, as 400. The changes that are happening in Turkish society, just more conservative, just as we see in the Arab world. The Arab world today, to me, as a man in his 60s, is unrecognizable.
It is unrecognizable.
Than the Arab world that I knew growing up.
Yeah.
Turkish society is changing in radical ways too. And I want you to discuss these long-term patterns in Turkish society vis-a-vis the West.
I'm a bit younger than you. It's still unrecognizable to me. But go ahead, and then I have a related final question. And so will either of you want to tackle this, Gönül?
Gönül?
I think when you talk about how Turks view the West, you have to differentiate between the US and Europe. Anti-Americanism is very strong in Turkey, and I think the US-YPG partnership, it was always there, but the US-YPG partnership played an important role. But when it comes to Europe, I think the picture is more complicated. Nationalism is on the rise in Turkey, particularly, when the AKP came to power, the pro-EU forces were stronger. But after that, after 2005, European countries like France and Germany started talking about a privileged partnership short of full membership. And that created a nationalist backlash in Turkey. So that memory is still fresh. But on the other hand, I think the majority of the country is very upset frustrated with Ahmet Davutoğlu's Syria policy, because Turkey ended up with 4 million Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
So that notion of we should lead the Muslim world, we should be more involved, I think that's almost gone. And that made support for EU membership a stronger trend, I think. So those who are critical of Erdogan think that Turkish democracy is in big trouble, and the EU could play. EU is the only outside actor that can play a constructive role in putting Turkish democracy back on track. So that's why they support Turkey's EU membership process. And there are others who support the AKP and Erdogan and are very critical of EU, but they still think that particularly the middle class, who have throughout the 16 years that AKP has been in power, become integrated with Europe. So they want an open society. They want to be able to travel in Europe. They want to, they don't want to lose the gains that they've made in the last 16 years. So I think that I don't have any polls on this, but I think support for EU membership has increased in the last few years, mainly due to Turkey's missteps in the region, the presence of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and the economic troubles that the country is facing.
I have one thought on this, and I approach this argument with some trepidation because I'm not Turkish, and I know that I'm missing kind of cultural cues and things like that. But try this. Let me try this one on you, Hisham. Can we fairly say that Turkey, for example, has become more conservative? Maybe it always was. Maybe Kemalism, those set of ideas that we associate with the Republic and that guided Turkey through many years, maybe those ideas actually never became common sense. Maybe they became common sense among a relatively small elite, and for the rest of society, were forced to conform to those sets of ideas. So that when the Justice and Development Party comes to power in 2002, it weakens these ideas because that was its worldview, was that Kemalism was something that was artificial, imposed from the top, and that over the course of the subsequent 15, 16, 17 years, it is part of the Justice and Development Party's success that religious values are actually more important. That doesn't mean that society is conservative. That doesn't mean that the AKP wants a theocracy. But that religious values are important to Turks in the same way that they're important in other places. It just seems that much more because of the context of Turkish politics and this kind of forced secularization. I'd say one thing about the EU.
Well, hold on. Are you just throwing that out as a...
it's a thought that I've had.
Okay.
It's a thought that I've had. It's a thought that I've written.
Do you believe it?
Or
you're not sure?
No, I do believe it.
Okay.
I do believe it. I believe that the reason why Kemalism, one of the tells that Kemalism has never become hegemonic.
Right.
I mean, I think there's one that's subtle and one that's quite obvious. The subtle one is that you go to every little town in the middle of Anatolia and there's a bust of Ataturk and some saying.
Right.
If people really believe this stuff, you wouldn't need to do that.
Right. Yeah.
Second,
that's a tell.
the military had to step in 4 times in 40 years to ensure this system that clearly people did not really like.
Okay.
One quick point on the EU.
Yeah.
I remember I was living in Ankara, how wildly popular the EU project was among that set of people that you would call Islamist. Because they saw the EU as a way of kind of being able to actually have a secular system. That secularism in Turkey actually isn't really secular. It was funny, they used to say, they'd never say the United States, we want secularism like you have in Switzerland. But then I think it was in 2009, Switzerland said you can't build minarets.
Right.
So they just said we want secularism where people could express their religious preferences freely. So it doesn't actually surprise me terribly that, one, those cosmopolitan alleged liberals who believe in Kemalism, that there's a kind of bump for EU membership. 2, I'm not surprised that there's a bump for EU membership because people are suffering economically, and the EU there's this idea that if you join the EU, you become richer. Don't ask the Greeks. And 3, that for people living within Europe means actually your ability to practice your religion as you please.
Yeah. All right, great. I will give you but we're going to have to be very quick. But yes, go ahead. Super quick.
Then how do you explain Gezi protests if the Western track was not there? How do you explain the recent results of the elections? I mean, you might be right on saying that, okay, Kemalism couldn't proceed, but I think there's a great support in Turkish society, both among the Islamists and the secularists, or even you can call as the CHP supporters, that there is a Western track all the time. That Turkish people doesn't dream to become a member of the Arab world all the time.
Well,
So this is a good question, and it will be the end of our.
okay, so let me just answer quickly. I was in the Gezi Park protests. I didn't actually hear anybody say that, you know, what I heard was they were opposed to police brutality, the arrogance of power, crony capitalism, and Erdogan. That was kind of similar to me from when I was hearing from people in Tahrir Square. I didn't take it as a Kemalist protest. I didn't take it as we want to be the West, we want to be good Kemalists or anything. I just took it as a response to a political environment in which people felt that although around them there was an expansion of participation in politics, their voices weren't heard. That's what I saw. I didn't see it as up with Kemalists.
Right.
Second, you know, of course there's a large part people in Turkey who see themselves as part of the West. No one said that.
Right.
But it seems to me that you have the AKP comes along and it offers some alternative that is deeply attractive to people, and it's not consistent with Kemalism. You can support the Republic, but not support the kind of drab conformity of politics that
Right.
Kemalism demands.
Well, thank you very much, and you know that is all the time we have. So I'd like you to join me in thanking Steve Cook and Gönül.
Thank you very much.
Great conversation, and please come again and tune in online. Thank you very much.